Hey guys, this is obviously a very delicate topic and is also a very complex topic, so it's a little bit hard to know where to start. We actually did make a video a few years ago about suicide in Japan because it is a question we get asked about quite a lot, because lots of people are aware of the fact that the suicide rate in Japan is one of the highest in the world. The reason for this video is that not only do we see suicides of individuals here, obviously about 30,000 a year, so it's about 600 a week. So we see that reported. Usually it's not reported unless it's something a bit unusual. It's so common, sadly 600 suicides a week is so common that they don't all get reported, of course, and it's usually only if there's something a little bit unusual about the suicide that it gets reported. So for example, recently people are jumping in front of trains here all the time. It's a very, very common way for people to kill themselves here, and someone jumped in front of a train recently and the train hit them and killed them, but then it drove their body back onto the platform where it hit two other people and seriously injured them. So that was reported because it was a bit of a different story, something a bit different from the usual, which is sort of sad all over, isn't it? Sad on so many levels. But what we do occasionally see too is multiple suicides where groups of people suicide, and sometimes it's just sort of friends. They have suicide pacts here sometimes where 2 or 3 people or more will agree to suicide together, and they all kill themselves together, or families. And just recently, the last couple of weeks, we've just had an incredible run of family related suicides, and it's just more than usual, you know, and it's probably just coincidence because it just happens to be, you know, a few of them coming at the same time. Again, if you've got 600 suicides a week, you know, it's now and again you're going to get random patterns, but just amazing. It's sad, you know. There was a lady of about 20 and her mother, who was about 50, jumped off a ferry. They were on a ferry between 2 islands in Japan, and they just jumped off the ferry and suicided by just jumping into the ocean. There was a father up in the mountains who was found in his car with his daughter, and it was a murder-suicide, of course. He'd killed the both of them. And there was another one in today's newspaper that sort of triggered this video of 3 people that were found in a house all dead. And you know, it's just really common, and husband and wife combinations are really common as well. So we do get asked about it a lot and the reasons for it, and sadly there's a whole bunch of reasons that contribute to this. One of them is that culturally in Japan, suicide is has been traditionally seen as a sort of an honourable and sort of romantic sort of solution, or a romantic and a sort of an honourable and sort of romantic decision to make or action to take. So you see it a lot in Japanese literature, and also in Japanese movies and dramas and things like that, that quite often the end of the story result is somebody killing themselves. Sort of like along the lines, it's a bit hard to relate to, except if you look at it along the lines of like Romeo and Juliet, you know, that final sort of thing at the end there, it's sort of, they kill themselves really, but it's seen as sort of romantic, right? They can't be together, so they choose to kill themselves. And that's a little bit like the way a lot of Japanese people, perhaps most Japanese people, see it, is that it's just that it's sort of that honourable sort of way out. So it's sort of seen like that, and then it's sort of considered to be a reasonable option. You know, it doesn't have the stigma. In a lot of countries, killing yourself has a stigma. You know, that you must have been insane, or you must have been a weak personality, or there must have been something wrong with you if you've killed yourself. In some societies it's seen like that. There isn't that sort of stigma in Japan. It's sort of an accepted thing. It's not surprising. I mean, we know a few people, including one Japanese family member who suicided. So actually I'll just touch on that one, because that's one that we do know a lot about, because it was a family member. It was a man who was 65 years old, and he'd retired about 3 months earlier, and he was just lost, because as a lot of people are around the world when they retire, you know, they're used to having their routine, and then they retire and they feel a bit lost. And you know, in most countries, people will talk about it, won't they? You know, they'll sit there and go, oh, you know, I don't know what to do with myself now. I've stopped work. And then they'll talk about it with their friends, and their friends will say, why don't you come fishing with me? Or why don't you come join our sports club? Or why don't you come and play cards with us? Or, you know what I mean? People talk about these sorts of things and work them through, and then come up with different ways of looking at it and sort of solutions like that. Whereas here, the answer to all these things is always, people always say gambaru. So first of all, people here don't like to talk about problems. No one likes to bring up anything or complain about anything or be seen to complaining about anything. So in this case, he didn't really talk to the family about it, because that would seem weak, and it would seem like he was imposing his negativity on people. So he just kept it mostly to himself. And that's exactly what happens here. People just don't want to talk about anything that might be a downer, basically. And then if anybody says, oh, you know, I'm a bit sort of struggling a bit or something, if someone does, which is pretty rare, but even if someone does, everyone's just going to say gambaru. And it's sort of one of the reasons that, another reason why people don't talk about their problems is because they know what everyone's going to say. Everyone says gambaru, which is just, you know, try hard or do your best. And people here will get gambaru'd to death, because what happens is, at work and at school and at home and everywhere, if you're struggling and you're having a hard time, everyone says gambaru, 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 which in some ways is obviously a perfect solution to most problems. Is to try harder is often the solution. If you've got some strength left, and this seems to be the problem, is that if people are in good health physically and mentally, and they're strong, and they're having a bit of a hard time, and everyone says gambaru, gambaru, and they sort of pull their socks up, and even little kids here, you can say to a 3-year-old, 4-year-old Japanese kid gambaru, and you'll see them pick themselves up, because it's so deep in the Japanese psyche, this thing that if something's difficult, that you just try harder. And it's a brilliant thing, it's a really good thing, and it's very positive and very productive. And, you know, instead of sitting around feeling sorry for yourself, gambaru. And it's a really, really good thing. It is a really good thing most of the time. The problem is when people reach their limit, where they've got nothing left, where they're starting to get burnt out, or, you know, and you see this with people with work, they get burnt out and they get exhausted, and they're physically and mentally exhausted, and they can't do it anymore. And what they really need at that point is to be told to relax and stop. And just, you know, in a lot of countries, if you saw a friend that was really burnt out and right on the edge, you'd say, look, take it easy, you know, come to my house and put your feet up and relax. And even an employer or a boss might say, you know, hey, look, man, you're burning yourself out there, you know, go home and have a couple of days off. Whereas here, people reach their limit like that, and everyone just says gambaru, gambaru, and it just pushes them over the edge. And this is not the main reason, and it's not the only reason, of course, but this is a contributing factor, is that everybody around you. So nobody's sitting around having therapeutic conversations with their friends about their lives. They just don't do it. They just don't do it. I mean, there's, of course, with all these stories, there's all these topics, there's always exceptions, you know. But generally, you know, we don't know anyone who does it. I've never had a conversation here with a group of Japanese people sitting around talking about a problem like this, you know. And that's individually, people don't talk about these things, and then the society doesn't have conversations about these things. You know, talking about the suicide problem publicly here is a really rare thing. It comes up now and again, but it's only skin deep. You know, that topics like that are really, you just don't see them very much, because the media don't like making stories, doing stories about topics like that, because they're negative, you know, and people, they're worried that people won't watch them, that if they do a story on TV about suicide or anything like that might be a little bit difficult, you know, a little bit uncomfortable for some people, that people will change the channel and watch something else, which they probably would, you know. And for this reason, there's a lot of important topics like this in Japan that just rarely get talked about, because no one wants to sort of rock the boat. I mean, you know, recently there's been all sorts of campaigns about all sorts of unimportant stuff, and we see that all the time. all sorts of unimportant campaigns. You know, there's a huge one going on. We showed you recently about the who is it thing, where people phone up. It's a phone scam. People ring up and try and trick old people into giving them money. And you know, that's a problem, that's a crime, and having a big awareness campaign for that is good, of course. But when you look at the amount of time and effort and money that's going into that campaign to stop a bit of fraud, and how little effort and time and money gets put into the stopping the suicide thing, and it's because it's just accepted. You know, people on all levels, just mainstream society and the government and everybody just accept that suicide's just a thing that happens, and they don't really sort of make much of an effort to do anything about it. You know, so what's happening with a lot of these family things with people going, particularly older people, suicide's really common in older people, and what happens is, if first of all you get people who have sort of illnesses and things like that, and they don't want to be a burden on their family, because obviously, you know, if someone gets some sort of illness, particularly in Japanese society, usually they'll be living at home with their children, so they're living with their adult children, you know. So you get a 70-year-old man or a 70-year-old woman living in the house with their grown-up children and their children, you know. And we showed you videos about that before too. That's really common here. And then they find out they've got a terminal illness, and they think, oh well, I'm going to be a huge burden to the family now, so they kill themselves. They hang themselves in their shower, or they, you know, do something like that to kill themselves. Go jump in front of the train. The jumping in front of the train one's really common. We get this all the time. If you live in Japan, now and again, the trains are always on time. Now and again, there'll be an announcement on the platform that the train's been delayed for a short time due to an accident, is what they say. And yeah, it's not an accident. Someone's jumped in front of the train, which is really tragic, isn't it? So it's really common, and so that's what happens. And then what will sometimes happen too is you get an old couple, and the both of them, you know, in their 60s or 70s or 80s, and they just decide that they don't want to be a burden and they don't want to go on anymore, and they'll just choose to kill themselves. So you get that as well. And then there's all sorts of other combinations as well. There's people, you know, there's such a thing here about conforming and achieving and you know, failure. I mean, you know, you get to see this all the time here. Anybody that fails at anything here, you know, kids will just cry hysterically if they fail at something, you know, because the failing things are considered. If you've been programmed and taught something, and then you're tested and you fail the test, you know, and because of that we see high school students and university students kill themselves as well. You know, you can see the problem. There's all these society things that sort of put huge pressures on people here. There's a massive pressure here to conform. In a lot of societies, you know, if you drop out of university, or if you fail at your high school exams, or you quit work, or you have problems at work, or you make some mistake, or you know, you get some illness or something, you just deal with it, don't you? You know, and then if you're having trouble dealing with it, you can talk to your friends or your family, or counselling. And this is the other thing, is that we made a video once before showing you a mental health hospital and talking about mental health in Japan. And you know, mental health hospitals exist, but people don't use them because they don't want to get labelled. You know, it's like living in the 50s here. If someone talks to a psychologist or a therapist or a psychiatrist, that they worry about getting labelled. And quite often what happens, you know, the family member's funeral that we went to, there's no sort of, the way the discussion went was, what happened? You know, oh, he'd been sick, and you know, he killed himself, and he'd been sick, and he hadn't been sick. He'd been sort of lost because he'd retired and he didn't know what to do with himself. So he'd been a sort of a bit of a loss as to what to do, and a bit depressed, and so he killed himself. He wasn't sick. All he probably needed was a little bit of therapy and a little bit of counselling, and he would have been fine, or even a bit of support from people. But just because of the way things work here, that's just not going to happen. And he just went, oh, well, I've finished my working life and I've got nothing else to do now to contribute to the world. He had a new grandchild, and you know, his son had recently been married, and he had a new grandchild, and he had a lot to live for. But the way he saw it was he had nothing to contribute anymore. you know. So it's just tragic. It really is tragic, just watching these stories every day. I mean, it's only the tip of the iceberg what we're really seeing, but just the ones that get reported. And you know, the last couple of weeks was just crazy, and it's no different from any other couple of weeks, but probably just the element of publicness to it. The fact that, you know, the lady and her mother both jumped off the ferry together was sort of a high profile sort of thing. So that's why that one got reported, because, you know, a boatload of people saw it. They climbed up on the rail and jumped off, you know, and it's just not going to change really, because the mental health care thing, you know, people say, you hear people say, oh, he's sick, or he was sick, or mostly the people who have problems here don't have huge problems. If they lived in a country where, you know, healthcare, mental health care was treated in a sort of a, you know, a modern way, instead of treating it like it was in the 50s, most of the people here that have problems would soon be okay. You know, if they had counselling for kids in high school and university, and just a more realistic approach to life, you know, that it's not the end of the world. You know, the kids just lose it here when they fail at something, some little test, and they just totally lose it. And you try and tell them, it doesn't matter, you know, it's okay. It really doesn't matter. In the big picture, it doesn't matter. But it's hard to convince anybody of that when the whole society's telling them differently. You know, and so it's almost like the society accepts that the people that can't keep up, killing themselves, you know, is their choice, and it's sort of like a natural what do you call that, natural selection sort of thing. Those that can't keep up just sort of kill themselves and disappear, and the rest of us just continue on as we are, you know. And it's just tragic because it's so unnecessary. But as with a lot of things in Japan, I mean, this video is just talking about what is. So, you know, it would be nice if this could get resolved, and that, you know, we could reduce the 30,000 suicides a year to something, you know, to zero would be nice, but it's not going to happen. And Japanese society changes so slowly, you know, the change, you can't see the change. None of us live long enough to see the change in Japan because it happens so slowly. So none of this is going to change, you know. And as you can see, it's such a complex thing that there's so many things that contribute to this. That the way society sees this problem, and the way society works, with everybody feeling that they have to conform, and, you know, mental health care being treated with the stigma that it's treated with, and, you know, this whole thing, you know, what the only way this would change would be if the government took on a big campaign like they do with these other topics. You know, recently they've had a big campaign about the overwork thing, and the overwork thing does contribute to the suicide thing as well. And that's what triggered it, was that there was a lot of high-profile cases of people who work for big companies suiciding because they couldn't take the workload anymore. And it was only because it was high profile, because of the companies that they work for, or the fact that the people were sort of high profile people, that sort of came into the media, and then that got people talking about it, and then, oh, we better do something about it then. So the government's been bringing in some rules and, I don't know, sort of skin deep sort of stuff to try and stop companies overworking people, giving them too much overtime, trying to put overtime limits on, and then a lot of companies have been voluntarily doing that. So, you know, it's likely that, again, trying to change the culture here on things like that is really difficult. And again, not saying we're trying to change anything, this is the Japanese government trying to change this too much overtime culture thing. And, you know, it's only sort of skin deep. On the ground where the people are actually working, it's probably not going to change much at all. But they're doing this skin deep sort of thing, and, you know, it's possibly at some stage in the future, probably triggered by some sort of international embarrassment about the suicide thing, that they might start to do some sort of campaign. But, you know, it'd just, even if the government made a genuine effort to try and sort of have some sort of campaign to encourage people to talk about their problems, or to go to professional mental health care people, because they exist. We showed you the mental health hospital that was actually quite a good one. We took someone to, and they're actually not too bad. But again, that psychiatrist actually just handed out pills, didn't actually do any counselling at all, really, not really, only skin deep. So as you can see, it's pretty ingrained. So it's just sad. It's a sad topic to cover because there's no happy ending to this story. You know, there's no happy ending to this story. It's just the way it is, and it's the way it's always going to be. And if you come and live in Japan, you're going to see evidence of this. You know, you get the train delayed because of the accident, and you get the odd story on TV and the odd story in the newspaper. And quite often they don't talk about the suicide aspect. They'll say a person was hit by a train at this train station and that delayed the trains for 2 hours, or they'll say, you know, a family were found dead in a house, you know, and they won't actually say it was suicide. They'll just say that these dead people were found, you know, mysteriously. So, but if you live here, you'll see it, and you know, after a while, you get to see the pattern, and you'll get to recognise that. Oh yeah, well, there's another suicide, isn't it? You know, the train accident where someone's hit by a train in a train station. I mean, of course, occasionally there is an accident, but usually it's not. Usually it's not. You know, it's just someone's decided to jump in front of a train. So I'm sorry, guys. It's a sad story, but again, we have to try and cover all aspects of Japan, and it's just not possible to do proper reporting on what happens in Japan without covering this topic, because it's huge. It's just a huge, in-your-face part of living in Japan. You know, you cannot live here and not have this come up and not see it. So it's sad, but we just have to sort of accept it. You know, I mean, on the upside, in Japan, we don't have the murder rates that people do in a lot of other countries where people are being murdered. So that's a good thing. But it's just sad to see people taking their own lives unnecessarily, and particularly these families. That's what triggered this video, is seeing whole families go. You know, couples and kids, and parents and kids, and all sorts of combinations of family members deciding to go, and that's really sad. It's so unnecessary, you know, so unnecessary that where most of the rest of the world's got modern healthcare and modern attitudes towards this sort of thing, where we can sort of stay on top of our suicide situations reasonably well, whereas here that's just out of hand. It's just so mainstream. Nobody talks about it. They just all accept it, you know. So anyway, sorry guys, sorry about that one. It wasn't a laugh in that one, wasn't there? Not one. But there will be in the future videos. We'll find something more interesting, more positive to talk about. More videos coming soon.